Well, when my eldest daughter was 14, I came home from work one evening and she runs up to me and she says, Dad, guess what? And I said, what? She said, I'm getting braces. And she was so excited, her face was all lit up. It was as if she'd just said, I'm getting a pony. And I was thinking to myself, poor child, does she not know? Has nobody told her? Because what was running through my mind was this. Because that's what it was like when I was at school. That wasn't me, by the way. Because the idea of wearing braces was something that you tried to avoid. It was a repulsive idea for most people. And yet here she was, really excited. So I started to worry about all sorts of things about her mental health state and her prospects in life. And I explained this to her in a very gentle, fatherly way. And she sort of said, Dad, that is so old-fashioned. All the teenagers want braces today. And sure enough, when she went into school, I actually said to her, what, even the cool kids? And she said, especially the cool kids. And sure enough, when she went into, has anyone got children? Has anyone seen that with braces? And do you recognize that the attitude towards braces in society has changed quite dramatically? So, I mean, this is what they kind of look like these days. You get to choose the colors and everything. And so when she went into school, when she got them the next day, all her classmates and even people she didn't really know came up to have a look. And she became the center of attention. Anyway, I think this is a really important thing for us as within audiology, because attitudes in society can and do change, but they never change by themselves. It's not like a magical day that we wake up one day and everyone suddenly decides that we need hearing technology. It's done because people like you and me work together to create the right conditions in society for attitudes to change. And so that's what this session is about. See, people are not born with a negative attitude towards hearing aids. They learn them along the way by the things that they see, the things that they hear, the things that they do, and the things that they feel. And so if we could understand how those attitudes work and how they're formed, then we could target those specifically and create the right conditions for attitudes to change. So that's what we're going to look at, is to understand how attitudes work. Now, attitudes ultimately boil down to these things, amoebas. Well, not really, but in every biological system, we have two drives. One is to avoid things that are bad for us, and one is to approach things that are good for us, even in amoebas. So if you take an amoeba and you shine a gentle light at the amoeba, it will work towards it, it will move towards it. If you shine a strong light, the strong light is an aversive signal, so it moves away from it. And you can even take, say, a herring gull. And if you paint a red, if you get something that's red, it will attack that red thing. But if you have something that's egg-shaped, it will want to nurture that thing. It's biologically wired into it. So if you paint an egg red, it will switch between two different behaviors. It can't decide, should it attack it or should it nurture it? So it's the same with humans. And just to illustrate this, would you say that most humans would avoid or approach that dog? Okay, avoid. Now, why is that? It's because we pick up the signals it's giving off. We see the snarl, we see the aggressive face. Whereas that same dog as a puppy, exactly, gives off a totally different set of signals, and we want to approach it. Happens more so with humans with our own kind, where we can pick out an angry voice in an angry face in a crowd. A smile we find attractive, it creates an approach-type behavior. And marketers and advertising has learned to tap into these signals. So people will approach or avoid cigarettes, for example, and smoking based on the signals that are given off either by the cigarette companies or by the public awareness campaigns telling us it's bad for us. So where does this avoid approach mechanism come from in humans? It's clearly not just biological. There seems to be something that's formed psychologically there as well. Well, there's three main areas. The first is that we avoid loss and we approach gain. So that's why we lock our doors at night time. It's because we don't want to lose anything. It's why we take out insurance. It's why the grieving process is so hard. In fact, we're more aversive to loss than we are attracted to gain. We avoid isolation or being cut off from our peers. We approach belonging, which is why we like to be liked by our peers. We want to be needed by our groups. We want to be important and know that we belong to the bigger picture. And we avoid threats to self. Now, that's not just physical threats. That's also the threat to our own self-perception and our self-image. It's how we want to see ourselves and how we want others to perceive ourselves. And by contrast, we tend to approach things that are consistent with how we want to see ourselves and how we want others to see us. And these three basic rules can be summed up with one a much more simple rule, which is that we avoid things that weaken us and we approach things that empower us. So if you think back to that dog, the idea of the vicious dog, if we didn't feel strong enough to take on that dog, we're going to avoid it. Whereas we feel a bit stronger with the puppy, so it doesn't set off the same avoid mechanism. So now, if we look at hearing aids and hearing tests, would you say the majority of society approach it or avoid it? And if so, what does it tell us about the attitudes and avoid and approach behavior? If they're avoiding getting their hearing tested, and if they're avoiding getting hearing aids, it clearly indicates to us that there is something about it that is weakening them, either their self-image or something else. And yet, for us who work within audiology, we know that shouldn't be the case, because hearing technology empowers people. It enables people to do things that they wouldn't normally be able to do. So somehow, we're giving off the wrong signals. So let's take that last one there, avoid threats to self. What is the greatest threat that faces each of us as human beings? Any guesses? Death. All right, so in fact, we're so aversive to the idea of our own mortality that we try to push the idea of it away as much as we can. And there's all sorts of things that we could talk about this morning if we had the time on that. But the other thing that happens as a result of this is we avoid things that trigger the thoughts of our own mortality. And that also includes old people. Now, I use that in a derogatory term deliberately. Interestingly, when we think of old people, we're actually more prejudiced as human beings against old people than we are against race, gender, religion, disability, obesity, all of these things. The prejudice in society against old people is higher than all of it. And interestingly, it doesn't matter whether we're a child, a teenager, an adult, an older adult, even if we're the age that other people will say we are old, even old people are aversive to the idea of old people, which is quite interesting. And again, if we had time, I could show you the research on that. Now, we know in society that as people get older, things start to shut down or things start to fail or fade. And one of the things that happens is people who are older are more likely to be deaf and hard of hearing. And you see these terms here, deaf and hard of hearing, they're usually used together. So by constant repeated association, when we hear the word deaf, we might think of hard of hearing. If we think of hard of hearing, we also think of deaf. Now, as people get older, if you are deaf, then you tend to need a hearing aid. So this becomes a symbol of growing old. And also, because of growing old as a symbol of our immortality, it all starts to become linked together in people's minds. Also, the idea of wearing something when your senses fail and your body starts to fail also reminds us things like false teeth. So again, all of these things are in people's minds when they're thinking about growing old. Now, interestingly, we know as audiologists that if you take an audiogram there and even a mild reduction in hearing, you have the f and the s and the th that you can't actually hear the difference. So if somebody says, "You're deaf," what does it sound like? You're deaf. Now, I can't think of a better way to make people think about their own mortality than telling them that you're going deaf. Okay, so anyway, this brings us to our first rule of how to repulse our patients. And you can think of this slightly tongue-in-cheek, although I'm making some very serious points. But if you want, you can think of it, if you have too many people coming through your doors and you want to try and reduce the waiting times or things like that, if you have any problems with that, this is a good way to repulse people more, okay? Because when we tell people to get your hearing tested, what we're basically doing is we're trying to remind people that they're on their way out. So here's the first rule of repulsion. Remind people that they are going to die. Now, there's some very simple practical ways we can do this. The first is use lots and lots of images of retired and elderly people. It won't just put off your younger patients, it will also put off people in their 70s and to an extent in their 80s. Believe me, it's true. The second thing is talk about age-related as much as possible. Make sure people realize that their hearing has changed because they're growing older, and what do they expect at your age. In fact, when they start talking about the problems with their hearing, ask them what their age is as well, because that will subtly put into their mind that they're on their way out. And then the third thing is, if you're going to have a hearing screening program, make sure it's for the over 60s. Don't do it for everybody. Make sure that you're making that link in people's minds between growing old and needing your hearing tested. Okay, so you can see where I'm going with this. So as a result, most people who have their hearing checked usually have it for the first time when they reach a certain age, or when they notice problems with their hearing. And remembering that people have often noticed problems with their hearing far more after the time when everyone else has started to notice it. So they're going for their hearing test, and this is what happens. Because by then they've left it so long that there is some bad news. So you see, the thing is that we create this strong association in people's minds that the hearing test is a bad thing. So get a hearing test and you gain a loss. Now remember what we said about those three principles of what people avoid. We don't want to gain loss, we want to avoid loss. So we're doing the opposite. The second thing is that you'll be seen as impaired. And why would we be seen as impaired? Well, if the only time that people ever go for a hearing test is when they've reached a certain age, or that everybody else knows they have a problem with their hearing, then it creates this association in people's minds that there's a problem with the hearing test and therefore a problem with you. So if, for example, I was to go for a hearing test, and I've never been for a hearing test before, there's now a change in my behavior. And people then start to say, okay, well, what has changed? It must be that the only people who get their hearing tested are elderly people, or the only people that get their hearing tested are people with problems with their hearing. Therefore, that must say something, that action says something about this person here. And that's one of the reasons why people will say that they're not ready for a hearing test or hearing aids, because of all the implications and the associations that come with it. Now, what they say is not all the reasoning. They don't reason it out like that. What they will say to you or me is, I'm not ready, I'll wait. So that brings us to the second rule of repulsion, which is mark people out as different from normal. It's a great way to put people off. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to make them act in a way that's different to the majority. Now, we're social creatures. We like to follow the crowd. We like to pretend that we don't, but we tend to do that. If we go to choose a restaurant or something, and there's several restaurants there, do we choose the empty one, or do we choose the one that's got seats but is obviously busy and everyone's in it? We tend to make decisions on what everyone else is doing if we don't have any information to the contrary. So if the only people who are getting their hearing tested are the people who have a problem, then what we're doing is we're creating a difference in that act, so people will avoid that act in order not to be different from normal. And then the second thing, of course, is that we can show them how not normal they are. And we'll come on to that in a few moments. And make it easy for others to identify them as different. Okay, you want to somehow highlight that they're not the same as everyone else, and they're not the same as they used to be. So let's think about that childhood experience that we've all seen. We might have been in we might have been on the right-hand side or the left-hand side. It might have changed at different points in our life. But generally, as human beings, we like to group things. We like to break things up into in-groups and out-groups. Now, this, of course, ties into that the second principle of avoid and approach, which is that we avoid isolation and we approach belonging. And so we separate people out. There's just too many people out there for us to be able to absorb that much information. There are too many resources that we have to share and things. So what tends to happen is human beings we tend to group ourselves by something that we have in common. And we tend to put other people into out groups, and we tend to mark them out. We tend to find something that's different about them and mark them out as different. So sometimes that might be something artificial like a label. And those who are familiar with sociology and social psychology will know about labeling theory and several principles along there as well. There's another way that we can do it, is that, so in other words, we can name call. There's another way that we can do it, which is that we can give them a badge of some description. And this interestingly is where the origin of the word stigma comes from. Stigma comes from the word about a mark. It's some way of marking somebody out as different. So a badge, it could be something like wearing glasses or wearing braces, coming back to the earlier thing. And if you think about all the teenagers wanting them, one of the things that has helped to change the social attitudes there is because it's become widespread. So that's just worth bearing in mind as well. Okay, so let's think about how this applies to our own field. We've got the in-group there. We've got people who hear as expected, I suppose you could say. And then we've got people in the other group who don't hear as expected. Okay, and what we do is we give labels. So if the majority of society are hearing as normal, then how do we label the people who are not hearing as expected? Because in some ways they're letting down the group, because if I'm speaking to somebody and they're not hearing me, that's actually increasing my effort, because I now have to repeat myself. It's so inconvenient. I want you to listen to me because I'm so important. This is what happens with speech. We tend to assume people are going to hear us first time accurately. And so we want to be able to mark out those people who don't do that, and so we give them a label. We call them deaf and hard of hearing. Interestingly, I suspect that hard of hearing was originally an adjective, almost like an adjective to describe the fact that somebody was hard of hearing, but it's now become a label in its own right. And again, those two things are very much associated. And another way is, of course, we can give them a badge. We can give them something that stands out, as makes them different because nobody else has one. And that's, of course, the hearing aid. So you get your hearing aid and you become part of the deaf and hard of hearing club. So we actually go even further than this, though, because we use statistics like 1 in 6 people have a hearing loss. Now, I want to ask you, what point do those statistics have in public messages? Charities use them a lot. Public awareness campaigns use them a lot. What we're basically saying is that 5 out of 6 people do not have a problem with their hearing, so most people don't. So if we come back to the idea of the restaurant situation, and we see that most people are not going in that restaurant, we tend to follow what most people do. So if I don't really realize that I have a problem with my hearing, am I likely to go with the minority or the majority? What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, most people don't have a hearing problem, so the chances are that neither will I, because I've got no information to the contrary. We'll come on to that a little bit more in a moment. The other thing that we do, though, is we talk about normal hearing. And often we might show somebody an audiogram and we'll say, this here is normal hearing, and this is where you are. So what are we saying to people there? What thoughts are we triggering with our descriptions? What we're basically saying is you are either abnormal or subnormal. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want somebody to describe that of me. We don't like to be average, but we all like to be normal. So we take somebody here who maybe the family has noticed that they're not hearing as well. So now they want to label because we have to categorize as human beings. We just have to do it. It's part of our psychological makeup. So they say, well, we can't really describe her as having good hearing or normal hearing, so we need an adjective. We need a label to describe that experience. So we look around for a label and we say, okay, there's some labels there: deaf, hard of hearing, hearing impaired. That obviously applies, forgetting, of course, that the same label applies to a whole range of different levels of hearing. In the same way that you might have somebody that is short-sighted or long-sighted, and you have different severities there, but we don't go around saying that somebody is blind if they wear glasses or spectacles or contact lenses. But for some reason, we don't apply the same logic with hearing. But from her point of view, she's had good hearing all her life, remembering that people approach self-consistency and they avoid threats to self. But now the group is saying, you don't really belong in our group, you belong over here, because we've got no other group for you. But she doesn't believe that she belongs there because all her life she's had good hearing, and she believes she can hear because if you ask her, she'll be able to describe so many things that she can hear. Because the things that she can't hear are completely outside of a range of hearing, so as far as she's concerned, they don't exist. She can hear the traffic. She just has problems in background noise. And don't we all? I mean, I think this is right in saying this, but I think everybody in this room will at sometimes experience difficulties in background noise if the background noise is too loud. Does anyone disagree on that? Okay, so what's the difference between somebody who has a mild or moderate reduction in hearing that they don't recognize, except in the fact that they're having difficulties in background noise? It's the same experience, but is it happening more? Is that how they judge it? What are they supposed to judge it by? So we have to think about this from the perspective of the person with a reduction in hearing. Unfortunately, we say, no, you must be in denial because it's obvious that you've got problems with hearing. So therefore, we've got to try and convince you that your perception of this is wrong. And so what we do is we tell them that they have a hearing loss, and we might say it in different ways. We might sort of say, okay, you have a moderate hearing loss, you have a mild hearing loss, you have a high frequency hearing loss. But look what we're doing. We're emphasizing the idea of a loss. And as we saw earlier, the first principle of what we avoid is loss. So we're telling her that she has something that she wants to avoid, but we're not giving her the means to avoid that hearing loss, because if you fit a hearing aid, are you getting rid of the hearing loss? No, the hearing loss still remains. So then we try to make it more serious because we're meeting resistance. So we try to explain to her, no, you'll never get it back. It's a serious thing here. It's so serious you need to take action. But all the time, we're increasing the cost of that loss to her. And then we find we're not persuading her, so we up the ante a little bit, and we tell her that hearing loss is linked to dementia, depression, diabetes, early death. Yes, there are studies there that suggest that your risk of mortality increases with a hearing loss. They all start with D. I don't know whether somebody needs to do a study on whether any condition that starts with D is more linked to hearing loss. I don't know, just like correlation, cause, effect, not sure there. Okay, so when we tell people about a loss and we try to get people to accept a loss, then what we automatically do is trigger the grieving process. And the grieving process takes time to work through the psychology of it. So again, that delays the time that somebody will actually accept what they need to do about it. The simple thing in my mind is not to trigger the grieving process if you can at all help it. So why talk about loss? So of course, they're not ready for all those implications, which brings us to the third rule of repulsion, which is highlight the losses that someone can never escape. Okay? So use the term hearing loss as much as possible. Tell them it's permanent. That's a good way, because that way it's not that you can't bargain then, you've got to just accept it. Oh, and if you apologize, you'll make them feel worse about it because now you're pitying them. So that helps as well because of the threat to self. And finally, link the loss to as many other risks as possible. Now, of course, this goes into the way that we counsel people, and this was something I became very aware of when I was speaking to people, and I was realizing that some of the things that I was trying to undo had actually put into their thinking in the first place. And so that's the first thing that we can do, is just become very mindful of the language that we're using with people. So if there's nothing else that you remember from this talk, and I hope you remember some of it, is that human beings are loss averse. We are more averse to loss than we are to gaining than we are to the idea of gaining something as being positive. So the important thing here is that if you are going to highlight a loss, it has to be something that they can escape from. You can't get them to accept it. You've got to shift the concept of loss onto something that they can escape from, such as mishearing. Because hearing technology can actually help with that. It might not be able to do it all the time in all circumstances, but it can go a long way to helping people to hear as expected by their peers. And also then, with the counselling, you can help to show the areas that they might still not be able to hear as expected. So then you can be using vision and cognitive skills to fill in those bits that they might lose. So in other words, what we're doing is we're showing people a loss that's future, as in the lost opportunities, the lost connection to other people, the lost relationships, all of those things that they can prevent using hearing technology. Now, if we look at some of these terms here, because we've been highlighting a little bit about how language comes into this, look at these terms here. Which is the most important word in each of those phrases? We're a bit close to this, so let's use some other words. Which is the most important word in each of these phrases? Okay, how many? Okay, who thought it was red? Okay, red was the most common one, but actually the most important word, of course, is balloon, dish, and ball, because those are the nouns. And the adjective, the red is just the adjective, so the adjective can't exist without the balloon, the dish, and the ball. So the thing is that when we come back to our terminology here, our framing or our focus historically has been on the loss and on the aids and the impaired. So this is where our focus has, and this has really driven a lot of the ways that we term our messages and things. So if we think about loss, we've already covered that. AIDS. Has anyone heard hearing care professionals say, they came to me and got AIDS? It happens a lot. I really think that it's about time we used other words. Use hearing instruments, hearing system, hearing technology, anything but AIDS. AIDS also suggests you're needy. If you have a walking aid, if you have a band-aid, see, it's not really a good word to use. Impaired suggests that you're damaged goods. Who wants to be called hearing impaired? So the thing is, we've been putting our framing onto here, which has been all about the condition. And a condition is a threat to self. So it's something that we avoid. Whereas here, if we were to somehow switch our framing onto the hearing aspect, that's about ability. That's empowering. It's not about weakness. It's about strength. And that then triggers an approach response. So here's a couple of practical ways that you can use it. Instead of saying, detect a hearing loss, perhaps you could say things like, detect changes in your hearing. Because you'll find that it is more consistent with how people see themselves, because they see that they have hearing. So whether some sounds are falling outside of that range, just like a dog whistle might be, or is it within that range, that's the important bit. So if we talk about changes, that can be both positive and negative. Therefore, it's a neutral term. You have a high frequency loss. Instead of doing that, we could describe it more functionally by talking about that some of the speech sounds are currently falling outside of your hearing range. So if you talk about currently, it sounds like it's a loss that they can escape from. So you have this loss at the moment in the sense that you're not picking those up, but we can bring those back into your hearing range and then they're available to you. They're accessible, coming back to what Carol was talking about earlier. Test your hearing. Test, what we're giving people a test that they're going to fail, not a good thing. Again, people don't like to do tests that they're going to fail. It's a threat to self. So you could talk about baselining your hearing or profiling your hearing or assessing your hearing. You need hearing aids. I said to my youngest daughter a few years ago, if I said to you, you needed special shoes, what would you think? And she sort of said that there was something wrong with me. So when we talk about needing, it automatically triggers in people this idea that there's something wrong with you. But instead, if we talk about maintaining the brain's connection to sound, then again, there's a loss that's preventable there. So keep the focus on hearing, not on a condition, because we approach gain and self-consistency, and we avoid threats, loss and threats to self. That's why we don't see messages like this. We see messages like this. In other words, it's consistent with how people want to see themselves. And we don't see messages like this. We see messages like this. In other words, how people want to see themselves and be seen by others. And we don't see messages like this. We're getting it all wrong. So this is a better message. I'm slightly biased on this, but it was based on these principles. Because the idea of getting your hearing checked should be as routine as eyes get checked and teeth checked. In other words, it normalizes it. So let's just summarize in the 1 minute I've gone over. I'm okay. Okay. Okay, the 3 rules, can you remember them? The first one is, remind people that they are going to die. 2, mark people out as different from normal. And 3, highlight losses people can never escape. Because then what we do is we weaken our patients. People avoid things that weaken them. And we're weakening them because we're making it about a condition which is a threat to self and all of the other things that we talked about. So what we really want to do is use the rules of anti-repulsion, which is the opposite. So we want to remind people about what they love about life and how hearing plays a role in that. We want to empower them to meet people's expectations, which helps them to be part of the group. So that comes on to that second one, that we want to feel as though we belong. So in other words, if we're using hearing technology, because we're more likely to be hearing as expected, we stay part of that bigger group of people in society who are hearing as expected. And thirdly, make hearing about staying connected. So in other words, empower your patients by making it about having the best possible hearing. And the 2 things that will change society's attitudes are very simple. Routine hearing checks throughout life, not age-related, not when somebody has a hearing problem, but throughout life, so that we can always be sure that we're hearing as expected. And secondly, hearing technology should be framed in a way that is about maintaining the brain's connection to the world, to people, to opportunity, mirroring really what Carol was talking about. And if we do that, what we're doing is we're making hearing care about here to stay, not fade away. Thank you very much.